what's up guys, this is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and today I'm doing my final predictions on Resident Evil 9 before it finally gets revealed to us, hopefully later today or even this Friday. At the time of recording this, we have yet to see any RE9 trailers, so this video will act as my final prediction video that I have for the game before we get some of our questions answered. Anyway, today I'll be talking about the things that I expect to see in Resident Evil 9. Not that I want to see in RE9, but things I expect to see. Also, I won't be using any leaks or rumors that we've heard over the past few years to make this list. This will be completely based on my own personal thoughts and opinions about where I think Capcom is leading the franchise for the next installment of Resident Evil. But before we get started, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, from who I think will be the main protagonist and villain of the game, to my thoughts on the setting and gameplay mechanics, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and these are my final bold predictions for Resident Evil 9. Let's get it.
Orders, Captain.
Pick up the rest of the squad. Plot a course for BSAA Europe HQ. Someone's gotta pay.
Let's immediately address the biggest question and probably the most obvious answer. Who will be the main protagonist of Resident Evil 9? Well, I think it has to be everyone's favorite rookie cop, Leon S. Kennedy. Now, while I would prefer the next entry of the series to focus on a reunion of stars with Chris and Jill being the main characters, I personally feel like Capcom wants to continue riding that Leon train for a little while longer. So, we'll see the return of Resident Evil's Golden Boy as he'll once again take on the role as main protagonist. I also don't think that there will be two main playable characters again. If we look at the history of recent Resident Evil titles, the only one to feature two main campaigns with two different main characters was Resident Evil 2 Remake, and that's because it was a remake, obviously. The last two mainline entries, Resident Evil 7 and Village, focus on a single main protagonist with smaller sections for other playable characters like Mia and Clancy in Resident Evil 7 or Chris Redfield in Resident Evil Village. That being said, while on the topic of other characters that might have a playable section in Resident Evil 9, I do think that we'll get two of them. Now, I've actually gone back and forth between three characters about which ones do I think have the best chance at appearing in Resident Evil 9. Those being Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Ada Wong. However, I personally believe that 3 additional characters is one too many, and for that reason, I eliminated my boy Chris Redfield. Despite having the biggest connection to the current storyline of mainline Resident Evil games, I don't see Capcom wanting to explore his storyline any farther until we get closer to that time jump we saw in Shadows of Rose. Instead, my money is on both Jill Valentine and Ada Wong making an appearance in Resident Evil 9. Ada Wong is a gimme if Leon is the main protagonist of the game, as she has yet to miss a single Resident Evil game that featured Leon. They kind of go hand in hand. Add that to the fact that there was concept art in which Ada was originally supposed to be in Village, and there's really no doubt in my mind that she shows up in RE9 in some capacity, with or without Leon actually. As for Jill Valentine, this is more speculation on my part, mainly due to the reveal that we got in Death Island. For those that don't know, the most recent CGI Resident Evil film, Death Island, revealed that Jill Valentine ages much slower than the average human being, courtesy of her being infected with the T-virus by Nemesis in Resident Evil 3. Now, this is a very convenient plot point to add to a fan favorite character to keep them young and available for future entries of the series, so in my opinion, Capcom probably did this to introduce a plot point where they can just continue using Jill as the main character of the franchise going forward. I mean, my thought is that Jill Valentine will probably be the new poster child of the franchise, and Resident Evil 9 will kind of be a way for Leon to kind of pass the baton down to Jill. Again, speculation. As for the villain of Resident Evil 9, well, I've had a theory about that ever since Resident Evil Village ended. See, I personally believe Resident Evil 9 will act as an end to a saga, and for that reason, I think it's important that the villain of the game is a major person or a major figure within the Resident Evil universe. Unfortunately, the franchise has seen most of the iconic villains get killed off already, and in most cases, I wouldn't really be a fan of seeing them revive certain characters. The more likely scenario is that Capcom finds a way to retcon Wesker's death, as he's a fan favorite, and there are already all kinds of theories out there about how Wesker could have survived. However, I actually kind of want to point to a different villain taking on the challenge of being the main antagonist of Resident Evil 9, Oswald E. Spencer. Before I continue, let me address the elephant in the room. Obviously, I know Spencer was killed by Wesker prior to the events of Resident Evil 5. However, I have a whole other video dedicated to the many different ways that Spencer could have survived, from that specific version of him being a clone to him becoming a part of the Megamycete hive mind. If you want to see more about my thoughts on how he could have survived, check out that video, as I'll have the link to it in the description as well as at the end of today's video. Anyway, with his connection to just about every outbreak and incident in the Resident Evil universe, Spencer will make for a great villain to end the next chapter of Resident Evil. In fact, we already saw teases of how he could be involved in the current storyline thanks to Village revealing that he knew Mother Miranda and that she was the one that motivated him to carry out his dreams, which ultimately led to him finding the pharmaceutical company Umbrella. My theory is that Spencer could be connected to one of the two major organizations that appear to be the most important part of the next chapter of Resident Evil: the Connections and the BSAA. Because Mother Miranda worked for the Connections at one point and that's how Eve was created, it stands to reason that Spencer potentially could have worked for the Connections as well. In fact, maybe he was the one to recruit Mother Miranda into joining the Connections, and perhaps Spencer is the secret leader of the Connections. Another organization that Spencer could be involved with is the BSAA, considering that they've recently started to use BOWs thanks to the reveal at the end of Resident Evil Village. As for the setting, I'm gonna go with a small town that also features an old mansion. And yes, I know that this concept has sort of already been done before, but I personally believe that Capcom wants to tie a pretty little bow on this saga by going back to their roots. Plus, Resident Evil 4 was an old village and RE2 was a city. This time, I would like to see a small town as the focus with maybe a creepy mansion nearby in which we can get Spencer Mansion vibes. Personally, I want to see Resident Evil's take on something like a Silent Hill or a Bright Falls versus the old village or traditional city setting that we've seen before in this series. So technically, while similar, it's not really the same thing. Plus, to kind of add an additional layer to this setting, it'll be great if the small town was surrounded by a massive forest, giving off major Arclight Mountains vibes, but in a small town instead of a mansion in the middle of nowhere. As for the title, honestly, never been a fan of the Apocalypse subtitle that has been making the rounds ever since we got Resident Evil Village. Actually, I'm not a big fan of mainline entries having a subtitle to begin with. I'm a simple man and I'm fine with just Resident Evil 9, and honestly, that's my prediction. No subtitles, no Roman numerals hidden in the name somewhere, just Resident Evil 9. But to make things interesting, I'm going to go on a limb here and say that they do bring back the iconic Resident Evil voice for this entry when you start the game up, cause damn man, nostalgia absolutely fucking rules.
Resident Evil 2.
Turning our attention to the thing that we're all curious about after Capcom successfully delivered on what appears to be completely different approaches for each of the last few Resident Evil games, let's talk about the gameplay. We don't know much about Resident Evil 9, but the one thing that we do know is that the director of Resident Evil 7 is returning to direct this game, which in a way actually says a lot about the direction that Capcom is leaning towards with Resident Evil 9. Well, at least in terms of the overall vibe for the game. Resident Evil 7 was a major shift back to horror over action. In fact, I would go as far as saying that RE7 was one of the scariest games of the franchise thanks to its dark storytelling, terrifying environments, and the creepy-ass Baker family. Based on the fact that Capcom is bringing back the director of that game, we can assume that they obviously want this next entry to focus on horror once again. With that being said, I think Capcom is pretty much done with experimenting with first-person Resident Evil games, except for VR editions released post-launch. We kind of got confirmation of that when they decided to make Shadows of Rose third person, and they even added a third person mode for the main campaign of Village. So I do believe that the next installment of the Resident Evil franchise will focus on horror again, but in third person. Basically similar to what we got with Resident Evil 2 Remake. On that note, despite me saying that Resident Evil 9 will have Leon as the main protagonist again, I don't think we'll get the same action vibes as we got with RE4 Remake in terms of the combat. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm gonna bet against the knife/parry system making its return for this next entry. Again, I believe Capcom is leaning more towards horror again, and having a combat system similar to what we got in RE4 Remake kind of contradicts that theory. Also, while on the topic of Resident Evil 9 leaning more towards horror, I do think we'll see more elements of survival horror in this next entry. Again, similar to what we saw with Resident Evil 2 Remake, this means limited resources, inventory management with an inventory system similar to RE2 and RE7 versus the suitcase that we got in RE4 Remake, and more puzzles, which is honestly something that has been lacking in recent Resident Evil games. And since this game will focus more on its horror roots, I definitely would not expect co-op at all, except for maybe in the Mercenaries mode or some kind of bonus game like that. Speaking of the gameplay and combat for Resident Evil 9, let's talk about the enemy types. Now, while I would love to see a focus on traditional infected monsters and a return to zombies for Resident Evil 9, I highly doubt we'll be getting that. In fact, the one element of Village I can see Capcom using from that game is the focus on mythical creatures instead of the molded in RE7, Ganados in RE4, or the traditional zombies in earlier Resident Evil games. For example, Resident Evil Village featured vampires and werewolves as enemies in that game, and there were even some concept arts released for other mythical creatures that were cut from the game, like mermaids. While I definitely prefer zombies and hunters, I also rather them take this dark, mythical approach in comparison to the Ganados and the rest of the enemy types that we saw during the action trilogy of the franchise. As for exactly what type of monsters we'll see, your guess is as good as mine. I like some of the earlier theories about skinwalkers and wendigos appearing in Resident Evil 9, and if we get some sort of forest setting around that small town I mentioned, then these enemy types would be perfect for this type of setting. Also, with skinwalkers having shape-shifting abilities and wendigos having the ability to mimic voices, I can definitely see these creatures really playing with sanity throughout the game, which I absolutely love that idea. And finally, let's talk about the story. Before continuing this section of the game, I do want to give a spoiler warning in case I end up being right about any of this. Obviously, I have no inside information, and I'm literally just guessing on just about everything I'm about to say, but in case I somehow, by some miracle, end up being right, I don't want people to come to this video and crucify me in the comments. Anyway, I've already mentioned that I think the only main protagonist of the game will be Leon alongside other returning characters with minor playable sections in the form of Jill and Ada. I also already said that the main villain will be Oswald E. Spencer alongside the Connections, and that it will be revealed later in the game that Spencer is the true secret leader of this Umbrella 2.0. So here's what I'm thinking. Since Leon works for the DSO, a United States agency that specializes in handling bioterrorism threats, I believe he will be sent on a joint operation with the BSAA, which is how he'll get involved with Jill Valentine in the story. Both organizations received intel about the whereabouts of the Connections headquarters and the location of their leader. Their intel leads them to a small ghost town in which Leon and Jill are separated and forced to continue their investigation on their own. We of course follow Leon throughout the small town and the forest that surrounds it, dealing with creatures that resemble wendigos or skinwalkers. At one point, we could even see one creature mimicking Jill, ultimately tricking Leon before he is saved by, you guessed it, Ada Wong. Apparently, Ada was hired by a different company to assassinate the leader of the Connections. As always with Ada and Leon, the two go their separate ways and encounter each other every now and then throughout the story. Same goes for Jill, although I feel like Jill will take over closer to the end of the game, and I'll get to that why later. Anyways, Leon will eventually find a mansion that resembles the Spencer mansion, in which we'll see Jill commenting about the similarities between this mansion and the Spencer mansion. I actually think it's this mansion section in which we'll get to play as Jill Valentine to mirror the game that started the entire franchise. Eventually, the two will find out that Spencer somehow survived Wesker's assassination attempt and that he's the one that's been pulling the strings as the leader of the Connections. Outside of that, I do think, and I know this is going to absolutely destroy a lot of you guys out there, but I think Leon potentially dies in this game. Either that or Ada will die to save Leon. Whichever happens, Jill Valentine should survive this game, and she's the one that ultimately takes down Spencer, and maybe we get a cameo in which Chris and his Hound Wolf squad arrive to extract his old partner, and they escape together. I know that's a lot to unfold, and I'm being very specific about my predictions about Resident Evil 9, but you know what? Go big or go home. Well, that's it for today's episode of Nerdspace Games. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on my predictions. Like, for example, do you like the idea of Spencer somehow being alive and the villain of the game? Do you hate my guts for even suggesting the idea that Leon dies in RE9? And do you think RE9 will lean more towards horror in comparison to the last few entries of the series? Let me know all of your opinions down below, and don't forget to check out my live stream later today of the PlayStation State of Play, where we'll hopefully finally see Resident Evil 9. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.